to the new episode of RisknFlow. And actually, this is also the last episode of the year. So remember also to subscribe, like, and comment the channel and give your support. Risky topics we have talked during this year. But today, actually, we dive into risks slightly different way as we're gonna investigate how we can communicate about risk to nature through fiction and non-fiction stories. Today, I'm excited to welcome to the studio an extraordinary professional in his field. And let me share some highlights first. My guest today, his career has been remarkable with over 300 articles, interviews, reviews to his name, and along with being an author and editor of 31 books and more. At the moment, he is a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute, and he continues his vital work on environmental communication. Also, he serves as a contributing editor for the Arithmetic of Compassion. After all this said, I welcome to the studio Scott Slovic.
Thank you, Jane. Happy to be here.
I'm truly grateful and honored to have a chance to talk with you today. So, there's a lot of topics I'm excited to talk. But first, Scott, we want to know a bit about you. Who are you and where do you come from?
Yeah, thank you. You've summarized a little bit of my academic career in your introduction, but as viewers of your podcast may realize from my name, I'm related to a well-known scholar of risk perception, the psychology of risk, Paul Slovic, who's my father. So I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and spent many years studying in different parts of the world and working as a professor of literature and environment at different universities in the United States and as a visiting professor in many countries around the world, helping to create a field that we call ecological literary criticism or eco-criticism. And now we use a more general term, environmental humanities, to describe the type of work that I do. So I happen to live in Eugene, Oregon again now. I retired from my most recent full-time teaching position at the University of Idaho in the United States and returned to Eugene, where I grew up and where my father, Paul, also continues to live. I do continue to do my work in the environmental humanities, which has a lot to do with the study of risk, the psychology of risk, and the communication of risk. And I hope we can explore that a little bit in our conversation today.
I'm sure we can. And actually, I had a pleasure to talk with your dad, as mentioned earlier this year. So I'm super excited to have you, Scott, here today in the studio. Mm, I wonder, you told this year also your career path to the risk and also the psychological side of it and decision making and all that. What about if you can you tell a little bit? Do you have any personal story the risk you have taken yourself to start the episode with?
Yeah, I was contemplating this topic before we met today, and I had a few different responses come to mind. One of them is the fact that professionally, I'm a specialist in the humanities, and it's actually very risky to get a PhD in literature and look for an academic teaching job where it's extremely competitive. I think one of the first jobs I applied for had more than 600 applicants for one position. So that's a form of risk, to spend many years studying a field that you are passionate about and to have very uncertain job prospects. So some people would say that it's a risky discipline to specialize in, the study of literature, which was my original academic field before I broadened it into interdisciplinary work in the environmental humanities. But also, one of the reasons why I study environmental literature is that I love being outside in the natural world. I love hiking, mountain climbing. I'm a runner like my father, Paul, and I often like going to wild places and running either with groups or sometimes by myself in remote areas, even in the wilderness. So some of the outdoor experiences I've had have been quite risky. And for example, once I was with a group of writers and photographers doing an article on wild bears in Japan. And this was in the mid 1990s. We were in a very remote World Heritage site in northern Japan, and our guides lost the trail and we're not sure where we were, and we were in a kind of a dangerous place near a cliff and a waterfall. And at that point, a photographer from National Geographic magazine and I fell off the cliff about 30 meters down a cliff, and landed on a narrow ledge. And there was another large drop off below us. So it was extremely dangerous. And I was busy talking with writers and not really paying attention to where I was. And to me, that was a
Right.
lesson of pay attention where you are. Sometimes the world is dangerous. It's full of risks. And if you're too much caught up in your own mind and in your ideas and not really paying attention to the world, it can be very dangerous. So I've experienced various types of physical risk in my life, and also the type of work that I do carries a certain amount of risk to it. Not only the difficulty of finding jobs, but I think sometimes venturing into an academic environment and trying to share ideas with people who may disagree with you is another type of risk that
Hmm.
all academics face when we're trying to promote certain ways of thinking, and we need to defend our perspective in conversation with our colleagues.
Whoa, that sounds really um, dangerous. That you fell 30 meters. Isn't that could lead to death in the
I
worst
know.
case?
I was wearing a heavy backpack, and the photographer was
Mm-hmm.
right standing next to me, and we leaned forward into the cliff. If we had leaned
Right.
backwards, we would have fallen into space, and it would have been probably fatal. But for some reason,
Right.
maybe our heavy backpacks pushed us forward, and we pushed into the wall, this sheer perpendicular rock wall, vertical rock wall,
Right.
and landed on this narrow ledge in the middle of a waterfall. And then another one of our guides had to climb up from the bottom with ropes and help us down to the bottom, but it was very dangerous. Um, and I think I didn't really tell my parents about that experience when it happened, but I've written about it in some of my articles. So if they read my work carefully, they would have seen my story.
Yeah, that's the story you want to directly tell for your parents. Yeah, yeah, I can understand. I actually share the same passion to running and hiking and go outdoors here in Madrid, where currently I go cycling a lot, and there's even though it's quite flat here, but of course you can find some mountains to go, and even the little lake we did a week ago, like 50 kilometers. And actually, sorry, I want to share just a little story. We went downhill like really fast, and I was behind of my partner, and I came down, and he was like, "Stop, stop, wait. She he wanted to film me." And I was like, what is happening?" And then I walked to see the view, and there was this huge drop and all this beautiful view. But of course we knew that there is this like a uh, viewpoint. You can see that the all the area, but if you don't know and you go, then you just go to the unknown. So there's
Right. What you're describing, though, I understand exactly what you're saying. Often risk and excitement and just a kind of a sense of awe at what a wonderful experience we're having. The risk is part of the feeling of awe and the appreciation of beauty. That sometimes we're most thrilled and excited about our lives when we allow ourselves to encounter risk. So that this aspect of risk, I don't consider to be bad at all. It's almost a necessity. We need risk in order to intensely appreciate what we're doing, the fact that we're alive. So if we took no risks, then we might not be as fully alive as we are when we take risks. I guess for me, though, that the question is, how do we manage risk? How do we how do we experience risk in a reasonable way and so that we're not reckless? And this is another thing I would say about myself. I've often had risky experiences, um, and yet when forced to make a decision about whether to push risk to an extremely dangerous level or to keep it somewhat under control, I'd usually pulled back. And for instance, when I was much younger in high school, I often climbed mountains here in the state of Oregon with my friends. And there are some very dangerous mountains in the Oregon Cascade Range. And there's one case in particular where I was with several friends and they wanted to continue climbing to the summit of the mountain with huge drop-offs, and there was nothing to grab, nothing to hold on to. It was very kind of rotten rock, and I just thought it wasn't worth the risk. So I told my friends, "Go ahead, you can reach the top. I'm gonna wait for you here, and if you come back down, I'll I'll meet you and walk to the bottom." But, at this point, it just seems too unsafe. And in fact, a few years ago, a young man did fall to his death from exactly that part of the mountain, that same mountain. So I do try to be wise and to use common sense, but I also understand the virtue of accepting a certain amount of risk in order to have a kind of emotional intensity in life.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good example, and always I think in as we touch the theme of the nature and climate change and all that, it's in front of nature you need to be humble because you never know. I don't know. Are you aware of what happened recently, a bit over a month ago here in Valencia, in Spain?
What happened?
Here was like a huge storm and rain suddenly came to the area of Valencia and surrounding areas, and there was like a huge flood that pushed away everything and all the cars and a lot of water, and people died and missing. And after a month, it's still a disaster, and people try to help themselves to get through everyday life, and it's been quite shocking here in Spain also, this huge storm.
I'm sorry to hear about that. Of course, it's a familiar story to anyone who pays attention to world news these days, that terrible storms, unprecedented storms that may never have happened on this scale in many different parts of the world. In the American Southeast, that we often have hurricanes, um, like typhoons or cyclones this time of year in the fall. And some of these have been the worst on record. And likewise, I hear about other storms in Asia and, just really terrible. So we, I mean, there's certain types of risks that we invite into our lives by bicycling down a steep hill with a huge drop off or by climbing certain kinds of mountains. And there are other types of risks that we would prefer not to experience. But in a strange way, I would argue, as an environmental scholar, we are inviting those risks into our lives as well by our lifestyle, by the public policies that we encourage or at least allow our governments to create. So I think global climate change is really not a mystery to most people around the world anymore. And yet we're always surprised when terrible storms come to our part of the world. Like, oh, we thought these only happened in Japan or in India, not in Valencia. So, um, but all of us are susceptible. We're vulnerable to what is happening to the global environment, and we shouldn't be so surprised. I have a colleague in my field in the environmental humanities named Patrick Murphy, who developed these concepts that he calls PAN, P-A-N, and DIM, D-I-M. PAN means present, always normal. Present, that's the way we look at the world right now, and we just think, this is normal. This is the way the world is. And we don't keep track of how changes are occurring over time, and we don't seem to recognize easily that the world did not always have these tremendous storms on the level that we're experiencing now, or other types of phenomena that we accept as normal in our lives at this moment. So present always seems normal. DIM, Patrick Murphy's idea of DIM is discrete incident mentality. What he means is you don't connect the dots. So the storms are happening in other places, and then we're very surprised when a storm happens in our part of the world because it feels like it's anomalous, it's different than the others. And so our failure to connect the dots, to understand the larger patterns, is one of the reasons why we don't act. If we realized that there are various types of interconnectedness that contribute to our vulnerability, which our vulnerability we may not want, perhaps we would be more careful in our individual lifestyles and in the types of government policies that we support that might mitigate or help us to control planetary environmental risk. But these are a few of the psychological
No.
tendencies that we have that inhibit our ability to act against undesirable risk.
Yeah, that's so true. And actually that leads me to this sense of you talk about the physic numbing. So
Psychic,
so
psychic, like we call it
psychic psychic
psychic numbing.
sorry,
Yeah.
psychic numbing, yes. In the concept of psychic numbing that those large scale phenomena are very difficult to accept and understand. Is that what happens with with, for example, as you described, with the climate change?
That's a big part of it. In the field of the environmental humanities, often instead of necessarily using the term psychic numbing, we use a term from the literary scholar Rob Nixon, which is slow violence. That
Yeah.
that the the large scale ecosystemic changes happen on such a large level, they're so big we can't easily perceive them. Nixon uses the word apprehend. We struggle to apprehend or to grasp these major changes to the uh, physical aspects of the planet, which are violent. They're changes. They're causing disruptions to climatic patterns, to uh, the availability of water, too much water or too little water. Um, they're resulting in extinctions of many species. We're in the midst now of what many people call the sixth mega extinction, a process of numerous animal and plant species becoming extinct. Lots of violent things happening, but so slowly or on such a small scale or large scale that we cannot perceive them with our human senses. So all of this leads to a type of numbness that we think so many things are happening, we can't pay attention to them all. And so we prefer just to look at our computer screens and not worry about this large chaotic world outside. So um, psychic numbing, slow violence, these are phenomena that result in our failure to pay attention to important things that are happening in the world. And as Paul Slovic and others have said in their work, the bigger the problem, the less we care. His phrase is, the more who die, the less we care. So uh, the the larger the ecological catastrophe, the less interested we are. If it's a small human level catastrophe, if we can focus our attention on one family or one individual person struggling to survive because of the floods in Valencia or because of not enough food to eat or something like that, we care deeply. We focus on intensely
Hmm.
on the individual. And then as soon as we start talking about several people, not even hundreds or thousands, but
Mhm.
2 or 3 or 4 people, we don't care as much. Our our emotional connection to the story weakens as the scale grows. And so, I don't know how many people were injured or killed or who suffered in the floods that you mentioned in Valencia. I imagine it was probably hundreds of people or thousands. That's at a level where the human mind cannot really pay attention anymore. So, so my interest as a humanities scholar and a writer is in how we can communicate those stories in a way that is meaningful and useful to individual members of the public and to government decision makers and corporate decision makers. And so the very psychological flaw, I would call it a flaw or a weakness that makes us insensitive to larger problems, that same weakness, that cognitive disability of human beings can also be a strength when it comes to communication because we focus intensely on individuals. So we need to tell stories of individuals. We need to take these large phenomena and present them in a very focused way that uses the power of singularity, of a very focused, small scale, recognizable narrative. That's not enough, though. I think what we need is something that I often call a telescoping process, where we tell individual stories and then we pull back. Kind of like with a telescope, you can zoom in and pull back to get the bigger picture. We need both the larger story, the analysis of what the problem is, the information about climate change, for instance, and we need the story of an individual example of the human impact of climate change. And this process of zooming in on the individual and pulling back to the bigger picture, moving back and forth, can be quite effective in keeping our attention and our interest as readers or as viewers, and yet also providing us with the information we need in order to think carefully and rationally about the problem. Because if you're familiar with the book that Paul and I did, Numbers and Nerves, um, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in the World of Data, we talk about the need for both emotion and reason. It's not that
Yes.
we just need emotional connection to a subject or just a rational analytical approach. We need to mix together emotion and rational analysis. So what I'm talking about in communication is telling the individual stories or presenting specific meaningful images, but then backing up and putting those stories and images in a context, in a bigger context that will help us to think clearly about these subject matters.
Yeah, that's really interesting approach, and actually, it makes a lot of sense to. Well, actually, what you shared with me that, and I learned with Paul that the bigger the number, the bigger amount of, for example, dead people, the less you care, even though it's supposed to be other way around. The more people die, the more we should care. But
Yeah,
it doesn't. As humans, it doesn't work like that. And the good example now, as we talk about the storms in Valencia, is that we read a lot of news that 100, 200 people have died, and many, I don't know how many are missing. But on the other side, as we have social media, people share um, their almost live experiences, what have happened, their families, their friends, and also we see this that influencers, sort of YouTubers, and who are making their channels on that platform, go and talk with the families. They make an interview unknown people in the streets to share their personal stories, which are the most powerful to hear and watch, almost in the live scenario. And that's really affects a lot of myself also. I've been also crying to hear those stories. People are left no job, no home. They lost their loved ones, and what else you can imagine. So this example goes straight to the example of Valencia, for example.
Yes, and what I would say, Jane, is that um, uh, my concern in telling those stories that you mention as being so impactful is that we can be overwhelmed by too many stories, right? If it's there has to be a certain pacing, or a certain kind of controlled presentation of those stories, so that we don't hear too many of them at the same time. If it's one after another, then psychic numbing will happen. Or related to psychic numbing is this feeling that we can't do anything to help. It, there's so many people who need help. Why do we even bother helping anyone? And this is another aspect of what Paul and I call the arithmetic of compassion. This is what we describe as pseudo inefficacy. We can't have an effect um, because too many people need help. But the truth is, every little bit that we do will help someone. It all contributes to a solution, to helping victims of a natural disaster like the floods, or even to helping a larger problem like pushing back against climate change. Every positive thing we do might be helpful. And so it's a pseudo inefficacy. It's a false feeling of inefficacy that we have. But if we're told too many stories at the same time, then we're likely to feel overwhelmed. We won't care as much. We won't act as much. So there needs to be a controlled presentation of the information, a pacing of it that will allow viewers and listeners and readers not to turn away and say, "Ah, it's such a big problem. I don't want to hear about it." Or why don't make me feel badly because there's nothing I can do to help. When in reality, usually, especially if we work collectively, if we join an organization or contribute to a certain kinds of organizations, those organizations do have the power to produce positive effects. So we this is another thing that we're studying right now, Paul and I and other colleagues, how to present information about seemingly overwhelming problems such as climate change in a way that gives readers a feeling of hopefulness. And so they don't feel as if, yes, it's a very worrisome problem. It's urgent, and yet it's impossible for us to contribute in any effective way. So is there a certain strategy for communication that may encourage people to contribute money or other kinds of efforts, and other types of communication that deflate or discourage people's desire to have a positive impact? This is what we're studying right at this moment.
That's interesting, and that I actually correct what you mentioned, that if the story you are seeing and hearing all the time, it eventually leads to the psychic numbing. And actually, when you scroll the social media, of course, you can see the same thing over and over again, and maybe as you mentioned, eventually you feel that there's nothing I can do, and it lets maybe even a worse feeling. And maybe to put it this in a larger scale, if in I think about the whole world, if as here in Spain, the people in Spain and the people in Valencia, they when something like this, a catastrophic thing happened, they rush to help, right? But if this thing, there is a war going on all around the world at the moment, and storms and hurricanes, as you mentioned. But if this happens further away, we don't have this, maybe in this scale, this urge to help. But as it happens here in Spain, and our people, and this feeling of nation and all, we want to act. I don't say it's bad thing that we, of course, it's good thing to help people that are close here, and we can do something, but it reflects the psychic numbing reflects, to the in the larger scale, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think there's something in common between um, proximity, physical proximity, being close or far away, and also scale. That somehow, if we're proximate, if we feel a nearby connection to the problem, we're more inclined to engage. And so, the larger the problem is, the more far away it seems. I think one can feel psychic numbing even if a large scale disaster happens nearby, if it's overwhelming. In fact, that's why Robert J. Lifton invented the idea of psychic numbing in the context of the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan at the end of World War II. When Lifton first came up with the concept of psychic numbing, he viewed it as in a sense, a positive thing. It was a way for the local people to survive a devastating trauma, an overwhelming and inexplicable at the time trauma of a nuclear weapon being dropped on a city. So people could continue with their lives in the face of this huge disaster because they numbed themselves to it. The problem is now we have these sorts of disasters, human disasters, humanitarian disasters, war, or ecological disasters happening all over, and they may they may not be nearby all the time, but we get information through the media, and we feel a certain numbing in response to the information that we receive. But but the sense of manageability, if the disaster can be reduced to a human scale, so we recognize in some of the victims ourselves, and we think, I can help that person. If I contribute to this organization, then people exactly like me or similar to me will be somehow saved or protected. Then we may feel this encouragement to contribute. So again, it's this idea of controlling the way we communicate information and the way we receive information that I think is particularly important. Also, I think it's a good thing for us to have some understanding of the way our own minds work, that which is what we're talking about right now through this conversation, and I think many of your other conversations with people about risk. It's a way of making the ideas of human understanding of risk um, uh, concepts that we can keep in mind and watch ourselves. We can see the way our own minds react to the world and to information. And if we understand some of the biases or the flaws, the quirks, I would say, of human thought, then we can actually recognize those tendencies happening in ourselves and maybe prevent them from controlling us in unwanted ways. So when we see ourselves becoming numb, we can say, wait a minute. The million people who are suffering, those are a million individuals, and we care about individuals. And so we should try to prevent ourselves from becoming overwhelmed by this very large number. because we know it really is related to individuals. Or if we start to feel like we can have no positive effect on a problem, we can try to control ourselves and say, wait a minute, we understand rationally that we actually can contribute to the solution, even though the problem seems overwhelmingly large. Um, and also another pillar, as Paul and I put it, related to the arithmetic of compassion is the prominence effect. The fact that certain decisions seem more prominent and acceptable than other decisions. So the example that I usually use is related to climate change and whether we will walk to our office or drive to our office. If we understand how the use of fossil fuels contributes to climate change and we care about the problem of climate change, we would normally seek to avoid using fossil fuels in our life. We would prefer to walk. But on a cold day, we might feel it would be much more comfortable to drive our car or, to use
Sure.
m motorized technology rather than walking on, in this very uncomfortable weather. So we decide to drive a car even though we understand that walking would be better for the climate. We're
Mhm.
so our personal comfort becomes more prominent than the problem of global climate change, which seems like a bigger problem. It seems further away and less immediate. So prominence effect, pseudo-inefficacy, and psychic numbing all kind of work together in our minds and help to explain some of our behavior, which may not always appear to be rational. We might say we care about these problems, but then we behave in a way that doesn't match our concerns. These psychological tendencies help to explain why we behave irrationally.
Mm. Those are really interesting concepts, and as you mentioned, to understand ourselves better, understand our mind, understand the risk. But I think in today's society, as there's a lot of news and interruptions that comes to our mind all the time, I wonder how many really are that conscious to stop and think their own thoughts and reflect and understand really that, hey, now I'm just scrolling the social media and nothing happens in my brain. I'm just going numb and going, and how many actually can be present and take that pause to reflect a little bit what they are doing nowadays.
I think you're probably right. Very few of us, very few people around the world are so self-conscious that they pause as they're receiving information through the media and they say, "Oh, this is what's happening in my brain. This is how I'm responding to the information, and this might not be a good thing. Maybe I should stop scrolling through all of these stories because I'm starting to feel numb." But perhaps through this podcast and through various types of articles that Paul and I and many other colleagues are publishing in not only in academic journals, but in the popular media. We published an article together in the New York Times, an opinion piece about 9 or 10 years ago about psychic numbing. So, we're gradually this information is getting out into the world, and it may eventually become commonplace for people to understand the tendency to feel numbness with overwhelmingly large phenomena, or to feel like we can't have a positive effect when really we can have a positive effect when in the face of a big problem, and so forth. Gradually, these ideas, I think, will ripple out into society and become more commonplace. And people may not even remember where they heard this information. They may not remember the podcast or the article or the book that gave them.
Right.
They'll just say, yeah, everybody knows about psychic numbing. Oh, pseudo
Mm.
inefficacy. I've heard of that. Of course, I feel it myself, but they may not remember the source, the academic source, the scholarly source of the information, and that's completely fine. That means these ideas have taken root in the public imagination and are actually starting to do some good. But I really do feel that a certain amount of self-awareness is important in order for us to live in the modern world where, the evolutionary psychologists argue sometimes that our technology has evolved more quickly than our minds. So we are limited by certain inherent biological flaws in the way we think, the way we process information. Even if we're highly educated and very good at computation, at mathematics, we are still limited by our human brains. But if we understand some of the patterns that define our ways of thinking, we can push against some of
Mhm.
these tendencies. Um, Paul Ehrlich and Robert Ornstein, the evolutionary biologist, population biologist Ehrlich, and the neurologist and psychologist Ornstein published a book called New World, New Mind in 1989, a book that I find very interesting. And some of the artists that I talk with about communicating about it, big environmental problems, like Chris Jordan, the photographer, filmmaker, and digital composition artist from Seattle, Washington, look at this book, New World, New Mind by Ornstein and Ehrlich, as really being very profound and fundamental. And they argue that in the face of the world that we live in now, the type of information we're always receiving, we can't evolve biologically any faster than we're evolving, but we can evolve conceptually. Our knowledge about ourselves can try to keep pace, try to keep up with the changing world and enable us to live effectively in this world. And that's what environmental communicators and humanitarian communicators are trying to help us do, to allow us to develop a new sense of who we are as human beings so that we can survive the world that we have helped to create through our technology.
Mm. Yeah, and what is interesting that information that's not something new, that it goes far back. The climate change, they we have been talking about how many years, so many years about that. We already know that those threats and concepts already exists, and still we don't take the advantage. Sort of, we don't take the advantage of those ideas that have been have brought to our attention already on earlier years.
Right. So I agree with you completely. And my way of thinking is that it's a communication problem. Maybe that's because I'm a scholar of communication. Um, and so what we need to do is find better, more effective ways of communicating this information. Something's not connecting. So the information is there, but it's not striking home. It's not moving us meaning people in general. So how
Mm,
can information about what's happening in the world be presented more effectively so that we can use it better in our lives and in our societies? So that's what I try to study in my work, and I attempt to do much of my research together with people in the social sciences. So I'm coming from the humanities, the arts and the humanities. I'm interested in various forms of cultural expression, painting, film, music, literature, journalism, and how can I use some of the ideas from the social sciences about the way the human mind works in order to help communicators achieve their goals even more effectively, and really um, promote their important ideas in a way that will improve society and help us to have more sustainable lives in a world that is full of risk, and much of it much of it risk that we have created ourselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. The humanities and the arts. I'm also a dance teacher, and I also strongly express emotions through the movement, and maybe that could also be some way to bring those stories to people to experience also those stories about climate change, and also have an impact on them, and art as the has been around also in the ancient times, and people always it's like go ahead, yeah.
No, no. Well, I was just going to say, related to dance, dance
Mm,
is a form of cultural expression that I think could use much more scholarly attention as a way of communicating how to live in the world in a world where there are a lot of things that we need to be paying attention to, and we may not be paying enough attention. In the humanities, we often use words like vulnerability and precarity. Um, there's a colleague of mine from India, Pramod Nayar is his name, who writes about um, eco-precarity, meaning the extreme vulnerability of the environment, meaning non-human phenomena, but he also would include human vulnerability, human precarity in that. But often precarity seems abstract to us. It seems like a general idea, and it's very easy for us to say, yeah, there are certain people who live precarious lives. They live close to the ocean, and so big storms might affect them. But I live in a city that's far away from the ocean, and I don't have to worry. I'm not precarious. So my question is, how can we help people in general to feel an appropriate sense of precarity, of their own vulnerability? During the COVID pandemic, all of us felt a certain sense of vulnerability. We lived very carefully. We maintained social distance. Sometimes we experienced lockdowns. We wore masks. To me, the feeling of precarity that that was almost universal, especially in the early weeks and months of the COVID pandemic, was actually a good thing. It gave us all a taste of what I would call healthy precarity. It because we need to live more carefully. We need to live more cautiously and
sure.
mindfully, just as we were doing during the pandemic. So back to the idea of dance. Dance has a lot to do with balance. And if we're not balanced, we could easily fall to the ground and injure ourselves. So maybe there's some way of offering lessons about balance and precarity or imbalance through physical movement, that could be somehow could inspire us to think about balance and precarity in our lives more generally. So, to maybe a discipline such as dance would be very useful for all kinds of people to begin practicing, so that they start to take to heart, so that they really care about the notion of a healthy sense of vulnerability, so that they live more careful lives. That makes sense?
Yeah, sure. The dance is amazing tool, and for somebody who really lives and experience dance every day, it's like a way of expressing and sort of being. But if I think about maybe just a, so to say, normal person, that also I would say help also in that um sense of um going inside your body and actually understand better yourself, your thinking, and your body, and all these emotions what you go through. So I think it's amazing tool also on this aspect what you just mentioned. But I want to turn the conversation a little bit about one of your articles you share with me, because it was named to like this to get a feel of what this means, and it talk about this thought experience. And one phrase that really stopped me to read was the example of the weasel. You wrote that the weasel lives in necessity and we live in choice. Can you share a little bit about that article?
Yeah, thank you. So this is a recent article of mine about Annie Dillard, a very famous American nonfiction writer and novelist, um, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974 for a book called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is a work of nature writing. It's about living in the countryside, in Virginia, and kind of paying close attention to the world. And I argue in my writing about Pilgrim at Tinker Creek that it's really a study of her own mental processes as she perceives the world around her. But Annie Dillard, about a decade after, or 7 or 8 years after she published Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, she published an essay, Living Like Weasels, just a small essay related to her life in the suburbs of Virginia and one walk that she was taking when she happened to notice a small mammal, a weasel, a predator that looks for other animals to kill and eat. And when Dillard saw the weasel, she found herself trying to imagine what it would be like to live her life as if she were a weasel. And she comes up toward the end of the essay with that phrase that a weasel is not so distracted from its purpose in life that it's constantly daydreaming and trying to imagine all the choices that it has in its life. It could be what kind of job could it have? What sorts of ideas might it embrace? Um, what kind of uh, book should it be reading? What food should it eat? A weasel knows what it does. A weasel knows who it is. A weasel lives its life in this focused, intense sense of necessity. And Dillard, as a literary writer, a daydreamer, an artist, finds
Mhm.
that her imagination is all over the place. And she feels a certain sense of frustration with the lack of focus in her own life and tries to imagine what it might be if she were to try to achieve a greater sense of focus and self-control in her own life. In other words, to live like a weasel. Um, and so this is the main idea in her essay, Living Like Weasels. Um, but in that larger essay of mine, uh, uh, to get a feel for what this means, what I'm arguing is that in a lot of her writing, not just the essay about weasels, other things, she's experimenting with certain ideas and trying to figure out a way to communicate more effectively these ideas so that we understand what they mean. And the phrase "to get a feel for what this means" is really about numbers and psychic numbing, where she says there are, 1.5 billion people in China right now. She was writing this many years ago. Now there are many more than 1.5 billion people in mainland China. But at that time, there are all these people. To get a feel for what this means, she says, take yourself in all your singularity, all your love, all of your experiences, and multiply by 1,000,000, 500 1,500,000,000 and so forth. So
Yes.
he's joking because we can't do that. We can't
Mhm.
do that type of mathematics because we simply do not have the capacity of imagining 1 billion or 8 billion people who are just like ourselves. Our minds would explode if we tried to do that. And and yet, in order to really appreciate the the meaning of all the people in the world who are have hopes and dreams and fears and a sense of suffering, just like we may have, we need to try to do this impossible calculus. And she seems to suggest that writers and other communicators have the task of attempting to do this type of multiplication that we're not suited to do. So Annie Dillard is a very interesting writer because she early in her work, many years ago, long before we began doing all this writing about psychic numbing and other aspects of the arithmetic of compassion, she was thinking about these in her own work as an artist.
That's really interesting. And again, we come to that conclusion that these ideas and concepts are not new. That somebody has already thought these ideas and concepts. For example, the psychic numbing and the example of amount of people in China and all that. And what was interesting also, you also shared in that article that she personally wrote you some letter and shared her thoughts with you. And
One of the interesting things about Dillard is that she wanted to understand compassion. She
yeah,
was exploring the meaning of compassion, and she's curious
mm,
about why we don't feel compassion. She wasn't simply trying to communicate compassion and to show what a compassionate person she is. Instead, she was fascinated by the conundrum, by the mystery of human compassion and the way we sometimes feel it and sometimes fail to feel it. And she was exploring, experimenting, as I say in the article, with thought experiments, literary thought experiments, attempting to get a better sense of the mystery of human compassion, which was kind of baffling to her. And one of the articles that I mentioned, I think it's called "The Deer at Providencia," she doesn't feel compassion, and she describes her lack of compassion for a deer that was captured by some villagers in the Amazon. And, the deer was in pain and suffering, and she strangely did not feel compassion because she knew the villagers were going to use it as food. But she seems a little bit perplexed and confused about her own lack of compassion in that case. Um, I wanted to say something else related to the use of stories in literature as a way of helping us to think about who we are as a species and to try to make us um, somehow process information about phenomena in the world that we don't seem interested in or somehow cannot understand. And one of the weaknesses of stories is that they often seem to describe things that we have not directly experienced ourselves. And in recent months, I've been referring to an article by Jacques Derrida, the postmodern philosopher, about nuclear war, where it's an article he published 40 years ago in 1984. I believe the title is "No Apocalypse, Not Now," saying where he says, we don't have the sense that there's any great threat of nuclear war because we have not really felt in reality an actual nuclear war. Yes, some bombs were dropped to terrible effect at the end of World War II, but it wasn't like an all-out nuclear war. We have never in human history had a real nuclear war with people shooting these terrible weapons at each other. And for that reason, Derrida says nuclear war seems fabulously textual. That's his phrase. It's like a fable. It's like some story in a distant land, that may not have really happened, and it's merely textual. We write about nuclear war. We have science fiction films and short stories, describing this type of devastating event, but it's fabulously textual and doesn't seem real to us. So the question is, how can we make not just nuclear war, but other types of phenomena such as global climate change and mass extinction and uh, microplastic pollution around the world and all these other phenomena that we should be caring about? How can we make them seem viscerally real, like part of our own lives, rather than fabulously textual? And this is the problem that many communicators are trying to wrestle with now. And when I was at a science fiction conference in China a bit over a year ago, I met a young professor from the University of Chicago called Patrick Jagoda, who studies video games and virtual reality games. And he was arguing that when you play some of these games that are related to phenomena like climate change, you actually you participate in the games. You don't just passively read them or perceive them. You actually become part of the games. And he believes that this type of engagement in a story, not perception or reception of the story, but engagement in the story through virtual reality games is one way of making information more than merely textual. It's not just like a text that we pick up and read or that we view. We actually enter the story ourselves. So I'm not an expert on games, but I was really impressed with his lecture and with what I've read on his website. And I'm wondering whether there might be new forms of communication, digital communication, that enable us to overcome the abstractness and the sense of detachment that we have toward these phenomena that we should be paying more attention to. So, it's not really my area of expertise, but I think scholars are increasingly going to be studying these new media, not just for like younger audiences who spend a lot of time on their mobile phones playing games and things like that, but maybe for all of us to at all ages and regardless of our technological abilities, we may in the future start participating in this type of information gathering in a way that could help us to to respond more powerfully to ideas that I think we should be paying attention to.
Sure, that's really interesting approach to the idea of those video games. Is I'm not the at all a game player, but I've experienced it through my brother and all that, and nowadays I think those games we play or the games I am familiar with are like those Call of Duty that are full of guns and you need to kill people. I don't know if, of course, I think there's some scientific research on that, how it affects and what are the pros and cons of playing that kind of games. But I'm not so into that kind of violent games. And what you mentioned also, or go ahead. What you wanted to
Well, I
say?
was going to say, yeah, these are a completely different type of games that Professor Jagoda and his team are create. They
Sure.
create the games and then they study the game players to see how
Hmm.
their thinking changes. And their games are they're virtual reality games, but they don't involve shooting things. They involve
Yeah.
solving problems and kind of grappling with situations that uh, go beyond a kind of sort of a military context. So, and some people would refer to these as pro-social games.
Hmm. That
So
would be interesting to. I would be willing to play sort of a game that you need to save the planet or save your living area or somehow for some threat or something like that.
right, right. Well, so I would encourage you to go online and just look up Patrick Jagoda, Jagoda, um, video games or pro-social video games, and you'll probably find his website. And um, but that's just one of many examples of people trying to use their creativity, their imagination, to find more effective ways of communicating about the risks that we actually face in the world.
Yeah, yeah, I sure will. And all the viewers and listeners also, I recommend them to go and see that website and see what is there. And also what you mentioned is interesting about the nuclear war and all that. As I spoke previously with Paul, we were the time of president election in Finland, and there was this debate with two of our presidents, and make a short summary of it. The other one was allowing the nuclear weapons to go through Finland, as I'm from Finland, through Finland's territory and land, and the other was like against it. And now the president who allowed that is the president at the moment. And actually, what you mentioned, that the nuclear war or even the climate change, we cannot see, we cannot feel it. It's almost impossible to have a lived experience on those two things.
Right. So with non-experiential phenomena, how do we make them visceral? How do we feel something? How do we bring ourselves to care about phenomena that we have not experienced? And this is the conundrum that Derrida was writing about. And I would say that many of us concerned with humanitarian and environmental problems or risks today are facing. And so you could say it's what I've spent my whole career studying. How do we communicate more effectively? And I think many very intelligent people, intelligent, well-meaning, creative people have devoted their efforts to trying to share information in ways that will help society avoid various types of catastrophes. Um, and I'm not sure, despite all of this effort, that we've succeeded very well. We still face a lot of big problems, and so many of us are asking, what should we be doing today in order to do a better job? And so I continue to try to do my research and ask what I think are fairly profound questions about effective communication of humanitarian and environmental risk and vulnerability in order to help communicators um, work even more effectively in solving these problems.
Yes, those are interesting topics and insights. And now we're gonna going at the end side of the podcast. I have two more questions for you. As at the beginning, I mentioned the non-fiction stories, and you as well describe it's a good way to get the people aware of these things that we cannot touch and feel. So how is the future is looking now with the research around these topics, and maybe the nuclear war, and what you are doing right now? Do you think we will find sort of mm, solution or improvements on these risks?
Yeah. Um, I don't know. As I say, this is for many of us in my field. This particular moment at the end of 2024 is a time to kind of reflect and take a deep breath and ask uh, kind of honest questions about what we have achieved and what we have failed to achieve. Um, I'm in the United States, and we've just had an election that was very discouraging for many of us, and it feels like a step backwards, in relation to humanitarian efforts and the goal of environmental protection. So I've just spent last weekend visiting a number of senior colleagues in my field um, who are leading writers, and all of us we're in this moment of pausing and reflecting and stepping back in a way and not just going about business as usual, because it's clear from the American election that our work is not reaching many people. Um, and in fact, I mean, many years ago, I had a friend from when I was a university undergraduate telling me, "Why do you write scholarly articles? If you care so much about these problems, you should be on television or you should be using other media to really communicate directly to the public. Instead, you're simply talking to the choir. And I fear that a lot of us try to use very sophisticated ideas and sophisticated jargon, or even poets and novelists may be writing at a level that only reaches other serious readers of literature rather than the vast public. And so I believe that we need to be asking questions if we really take these problems seriously, asking questions about the way we're using language, about the media in which we're sharing our thoughts and discoveries. Um, I'm very happy to be doing a podcast with you because I think a podcast is one of these new outlets of information as opposed to simply writing for a scholarly journal. So in my field of ecological literary studies or eco-criticism, I talk about the waves, the phases of my field, from the earlier phase when people just started doing environmental literary studies to the present. And I have argued that we are now in the fifth wave of eco-criticism, the emphasis of which is on going public, finding ways to go public with ideas, um, through writing for newspapers, writing for websites, writing blogs, um, writing for audiences outside of our specific discipline, using digital media like podcasts, and maybe also, y- you know, possibly using television. Who knows? I would not limit ourselves in any way, but I do believe we need to be going public in ways that we in the environmental arts and humanities have not successfully done in the past. And that's why I mentioned in my earlier comment, digital games. I think that's a way of reaching audiences who would never pick up one of our scholarly journals or read one of our books. Obviously, I'm sitting in an office full of books, very old-fashioned, very analog and not digital. But at the same time, I believe that to go public is a very important new phase in my field of the environmental humanities. And I've been trying to do that in certain ways, such as the website that Paul and I help to manage. But I think we need to be more creative and find other ways of sharing ideas. So that I believe is an important part of the future of my field.
I 100% agree. And as we can maybe see the gap of generations, that my background is empty. At the moment, there's nothing, and you have full of books. I have a few books, but few books, maybe less than 10 at the moment, but I also read digital um, books at the moment. So maybe that's the idea of going digital through different games, and I give all my support as I bring you here also to the podcast talk with me. And the risk is such an interesting topic, and as with your dad, as with you, we see the time flies. We have talked 1 hour 15 minutes, but let me allow to have a last question for you, Scott.
Okay.
I'd like to ask, as I also ask normally for my guests who are entrepreneurs and risk takers on their professions, I'd like to ask that um, what is your maybe biggest risk in life, and did that risk paid off eventually? What do you think?
Maybe I would circle back to one of the risks that I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation when I said I take physical risks in my life as an outdoor adventurer, but I also, I think, took a professional risk in becoming a professor of humanities and, with not a very certain career path. And for me, taking professional risks, choosing a field that may not have very clear job prospects, um, it it actually has inspired me to be entrepreneurial, to try new things. Not only I not only did I choose to study literature, but I chose to study nature writing, which was almost an unknown field when I was a PhD student. There were not a lot of scholars of nature writing. So I thought nature writing is beautiful, nature writing is interesting, nature writing seems connected with what's happening in the world. And I think it's a good thing for us to pay attention to the world. So I helped to develop the entire field of ecological literary studies as a PhD student when I was still in my 20s as a PhD student. So I was taking professional risks from an early age, and it enabled me to actually create what has become a worldwide field and
Mm-hmm.
enabled me to spend a lot of time with students and colleagues all over the world, helping to develop the field. It's been very enriching for me and in a sense, successful for me, even if we still have many problems in the world that we're trying to solve. Still, I feel as if by taking professional risks, it has enabled me to be entrepreneurial and creative and help to produce an academic field that I think is very meaningful for many people. So, with my own students over the years, I've often encouraged them also to be entrepreneurial and risk taking in a common sense way, not not to be suicidal and to take reckless risks that would lead to no job, no career, no publications, no success at all, but to take careful risks in order to do something important. And that's what I've
Mm.
tried to do professionally, and that I think is one of the reasons why eco-criticism has become a rather successful and valuable field in countries throughout the world as a result of being willing to take some professional risks.
That's a good answer, and it's always such an inspiring thing to hear that you, as a such a young age, a professional, a PhD student, you take those decisions and you took those risks to maybe change something in your field for in in that moment, but eventually for the future, as we see the results today that you and your dad have made remarkable research, and I'm super thrilled and honored to have had an opportunity to talk with you, Scott, today. And I just really want to express my thankfulness for you to be here in the studio, being in the Risk and Flow today with me. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. And also, Risk and Flow want to say thank you for all listeners and viewers. And we see in the next year. So I wish everyone have happy holidays and enjoy the Christmas and New Year. Bye bye.